Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. Here with my co-host, Dave Burstein.
Hello.
How you doing, Dave?
Not too bad. I saw
No?
some unbelievable illustrations last night that were generated in real time by artificial intelligence. But we'll
Wow.
get back to that later in the
Okay.
show.
All right. Well, I wanted to get started talking a little bit about this relatively new social media, if you will, platform called Mastodon, which has just recently gotten a whole bunch of new users. It's a Twitter-like platform, but unlike Twitter, it's not controlled by any single individual or company. Um, Created by a young German guy, 29-year-old guy named Eugene Rocco. And it's a distributed network that uses distributed servers that are located all around the world. Folks can join the network by putting their own server together and interconnecting with this network of servers, which together is the Mastodon network. And their interlink community is something called Fediverse, unusual name. But in any event, I recently looked at an interview of this Eugene Rocco guy. Just spoke to Wired magazine about 10 days ago. And interestingly, shortly after Musk took over Twitter and it started to devolve as it has over the last several weeks, within like a week, Mastodon got 800,000 new users. So
1 million, actually.
yeah, okay.
And I was one of
So,
them.
You joined it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to want to hear about that, but let me just give a quick overview of this guy's vision. He wanted to create a platform, as I mentioned earlier, that's not controlled by any individual person, and he believed that the lack of the profit motive and his candid design, quote unquote, would discourage harassment, abuse, and provide users more control over the platform. So you just joined. What's your sense of it, Dave? I mean, as a
I'm
user.
Dave's News, and which I also have on Twitter. And I've just been testing it. I haven't set up any real yet.
Mm-hmm.
It works. Okay. You do not need to go to Twitter to get the word out to people who know you. Period.
Mm-hmm.
You, of course, could do it on Facebook too, but yeah. And this is one about 6 that are suddenly interesting. Another one is called press.something. But you can't join that one right now because they were sensibly didn't want to have 1 million people signed up because they couldn't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Mastodon is staying live and well and working, despite there being 1 million users. It's very well designed.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the design, Dave. I'm a little confused. It's decentralized, but yet how does one server talk to many servers given their decentralized architecture?
It gets passed on, ideally to the server where the person has their account, but if not, it'll get passed on again and again until it gets there.
Okay.
So there are about 20 servers around the world.
Mm-hmm.
We could open one up on WHCR. We could do it with just any computer. We put in a corner with a connection.
Mm-hmm.
One computer probably isn't quite enough. Most of them are going to half a dozen, and some of them are going to go to more. So we're going to see them all asking for donations, but we're talking about a very little cost per user.
Mm-hmm. Apparently that's one of the benefits of creating a network like this is because it's decentralized. You don't have one massive server with 1 million users on one server. It's decentralized. As you said, there are 20 right now. I imagine that number is going to start to proliferate, the number of servers around the world.
Well, it's all open source code, and you're welcome to do it. So is our radio station if we wanted to. Although I'm not volunteering. Sorry, Angela. Now, open source is just that. You can go to GitHub or wherever, and the website, you can go to Mastodon itself and start there and get the entire program. That means you know how to work with programs. I think it's in Python, but I'm not sure. You can do anything you want with it. You could, for example, link it directly to the next thing we're going to talk about, which is generative artificial intelligence, but on Mastodon. The problem with Mastodon, there are two real problems with Mastodon right now. One is most people aren't on it. So that why a million signed up, there 500 million signed up to Twitter. And every day I get one or two more logging on to one of mine.
Wait, Dave, did you say 500 million people on Twitter?
Something like that. That's a guess.
Wow, that's massive.
Well, Facebook gets over 1 billion every day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Twitter is playing an interesting role in Iran and in China. We can get to that if we want to.
Yeah, what's going on there? I mean, I don't know if we talked about this last week just before the election. I think we may have. Musk jumping out there and encouraging folks to vote Republican. So I think you had mentioned on the show that, well, he did it as an individual user, not as the owner proprietor of Twitter. But still, I thought it was a little inappropriate in my mind as the owner of Twitter for him to jump out there like that. But what's going on the international scene with Twitter?
Okay. There are two extraordinary things, no, not so extraordinary things happening. There are people in the streets opposing the regime, both in Iran and China. I took back the extraordinary because there's also people fighting militantly against the regime in Ethiopia and the Eastern Congo, among other, and Mali, among other places. And the press that most of us read, including me, comes out of the Western world, which is mostly white. So suddenly, Ukraine is one of the biggest tragedies of our generation. And the people killed in Syria or Tigray or the Congo virtually are invisible.
Right.
They're starving right now in Sudan, literally starving to death. The doctors there have been begging for money and food. The U.S. has provided about $70 billion worth of ammunition to Ukraine. The Europeans add up to it, and there's another 40 billion pending. That's the only thing that gave Ukraine any possibility. They're now able to shoot off literally 10 times as much ammunition as the Russians.
Wow.
And the U.S. is worried because we've shifted so much artillery there and missiles that we're not sure that we have enough to defend Taiwan and Korea, if it comes to that. Okay. That's something that is part of the world that this is not a show about. You can guess my opinions on any of these.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about Twitter and the role that it's playing in some of these conflicts and struggles.
Yeah, and I happen to know a fair amount about what's happening in Iran and in China. Because I sit on the internet 10 hours every day chasing news and writing about it. So I see a whole lot, and I always was a news junkie. China is the most interesting one because it's not clear what's going to happen in China, and it's not clear what's the right thing to happen in China. Do you think it's right to kill 1 million Chinese? That's a question.
I don't think it's right to kill anyone, but I think that was probably rhetorical, Dave.
No, absolutely not. That's essentially the position the New York Times is taking. The New York Times, whose reporters hate the Chinese Communist Party, have been playing up the remarkable opportunities in the people going into the streets. And will it be a real opinion? Oh, we hope so. And why is it happening? Because China shut down a whole lot of places to avoid COVID.
Hmm.
Now, I said, it's not clear what's right. It may be right to let 1 million people die and get the Chinese economy moving, because if the Chinese economy is moving, they'll earn enough to keep 2 million people alive. I doubt it.
Let me just be clear, Dave. You're saying the people are dying because of the shutdown and restrictions in response to COVID. What is it that's killing the
Now,
people?
that is a number that comes out of, I think, The Lancet, one of the reliable medical magazines, comes from England, who figured out that if they didn't do the shutdown, China would look not quite as bad as the United States. The United States has lost 1 million people already. In China, it's probably under 20,000. And China, of course, is 4 times our population. Currently, we're losing 300 people every day. The epidemic is not over. In China, anybody who dies from COVID, that's important enough to make the newspapers. I doubt they have, most weeks they have fewer than a dozen.
Hmm.
And as I say, we haven't. So, a group of doctors in the British Medical Journal said, okay, let us look at the population, the age of the population, the ability of the medical system to cope, and so on, and say what would have happened if the Chinese do a wide opening, do what most people are doing here in New York, which is basically ignoring it, especially if you get vaccine. And the answer is yes. China would start losing people at the rate the United States lost them. That it would be unlikely to get less than 1.5 million people dying of COVID in the next 2 years if they fully open and nothing else comes in. There's a lot of good news coming on the vaccine front. So it hopefully won't happen that way. Mm-hmm. But you have, those are the stakes, and that's why I hate the Times on this, because they're just ignoring that, because the people writing for the Times are so anxious to destroy the Communist Party, which, among other things, throws New York Times reporters out of the country on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. Most of what you hear about China in the US press is seriously uninformed and often propaganda. And at this point, a huge percentage of the United States and United States reporters have been turned against China by a 10-year campaign to talk about all the terrible things that are happening there. Mm-hmm. You know, like the Georgia prisons, where how many people die every year? Or, I mean, we have more human beings locked up in cages than China does, and they have 4 times our population. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Even adjusting for population, we have far more people locked up in cages than any other Western country. Now, is this true? Yes. Is this important? Yes. How often do you hear it?
Not very often. You know, traditional media has always, in my mind, my personal opinion, been working on behalf of the power structure and moneyed interests, and has very often operated with I won't say I don't want to impugn necessarily evil intentions, but certainly propagandistic in support of the current regimes and the current moneyed interests and current corporate interests. I think that's kind of a given.
And I can talk the whole show worth on how that's happening and why most of it is indirect, and what it has to do with contributions in Washington, mm-hmm. and what the Federalist Society and all this stuff. But that's not our show.
No, we want to talk a little bit about how the new media is also participating in the same game. We're talking about Twitter and what they're doing overseas in giving a voice or not giving a voice to some of the underserved and the downtrodden. So what's your take on what's going on? You were talking about Twitter and I think Iran, and Twitter and China. So what's going on with Twitter over there, and has Musk's takeover impacted that at all?
It hasn't impacted it in any way.
Okay.
The issue that both China and Iran have serious censorship. China's is probably the most effective in the world. We talk about the US as a surveillance state. China has 10 times as many. We know that everything you say on the internet is intercepted by a wing of the United States government most of the times.
Mm.
China not merely intercepts it and watches it, but actively blocks anything. So they don't let Twitter into China, but there's several others, Chinese things that are, I think one of them is as large as Twitter. It's in the hundreds of millions.
Mm-hmm.
And Weibo, and everybody uses it over there, including the government. That is totally censored. And anything talking about the demonstrators in Chongqing or Beijing or Urumqi will not go across that network.
Mm-hmm.
They have much better filters to get rid of the stuff they don't want than Twitter does, which, as we know, all kinds of horrible things get across, including things like child pornography. When I talk to somebody who lived through the 60s and 70s in China, like Helen Zhao at the ITU, it was a terrible time. In 59, the question is whether 5 million people died or 15 million people. When there was a stupid policy in the economy, it was a great leap forward that utterly failed. And nobody was willing to admit to the central government they were failing, so they encouraged it. And historians are arguing now about how many people died. That happened any time there was a famine in China. And the weather did vary enough that every 10 or 20 years, there would be a famine that killed millions of people. That hasn't happened in the last 20 years or the last 30 years. Because China can afford to feed all its people, and it has a government that is committed to that. And there are lots of things I could say wrong happening in China, as I can in my country. It definitely is authoritarian. You definitely cannot be a political opponent. And on some issues, anything that's political, there is no freedom of speech at all. On most other things, like which mobile phone do you want to buy and whether you should boycott Apple because the Americans want to go to war with us, that people can talk about, actually. But anything that worried the Chinese Communist Party. And the reason it's that is that, like anything in government, any government anywhere, the generals in Brazil right now, the generals in Argentina and Chile a little while ago, both Weimar and there's their successor, which really was the Nazis. The politicians didn't want to give up their office. That's actually a big thing that motivates most people in Congress in the United States. They do a lot of things. They do a lot of things they really hate because they need the support and they need the money to get reelected.
Well, I think that's just the nature of power in general.
But China is different. Xi Jinping and almost everybody else ruling China lived through the period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where the Communist Party took over China and did some things right, but an awful lot of things wrong, and did not build up the economy to the point where it could feed everybody. It was that bad, as it was in 1940 and 1920 and 1900. China has been desperately poor, desperately unequal. Paul Buck, who nobody remembers now, won a Nobel Prize in the 1930s for a book I think it was called The Good Earth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I read that when I was probably 10 or 12. And in that, there was a story of somebody who sold their daughter to a rich family for two reasons. One, they really needed the money. And two, they knew that they didn't have the money to get the food to keep her alive if they kept her.
Mm.
And
Wow.
that really hit home,
Hmm.
especially because I have a story about like that in my grandmother's generation in 1905 in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Wow. Okay,
yeah.
Dave. Well, I think it's about time for a break. Uh,
Okay. I
and
will. Let me give you one thing about Twitter.
okay.
People think Twitter is going to have lots of problems. Absolutely. Some of them may be terrible. A lot of people think Elon Musk is going to do some terrible things, including putting Donald Trump back there, and some of that will happen. It's highly unlikely that people will abandon Twitter because when you're in the game of communicating, you need an audience, and the audience is at Twitter. And even though Mastodon has the same functions, it's not going to have the audience for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What 1 million
So
versus 500 million? I mean, that's no contest.
yeah. Now, it's good, and I can give you more in the open source when we come back after the
Okay.
break.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. And this is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Tech Talk.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day. It's a new life for me, yeah. It's a new dawn, it's a new day. It's a new life for me. Woo, 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 and I'm feeling good. Fish in the sea, you know how I feel. River running free, you know how I feel. Blossom on the tree, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me, and I'm feeling good. Dragonfly out in the sun, you know what I mean, don't you know? Butterflies all having fun, you know what I mean. Sleep in peace when day is done, that's what I mean. And this old world is a new world and a bold world for me. Yeah, yeah. Stars, when you shine, you know how I feel. Scent of the pine, you know how I feel. Oh, freedom is mine, and I know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. I'm feeling
Okay, we're back. Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed on WHCR 90.3. before the break, we were talking a little bit about Twitter, what's going on with it, talking about a competitor, Mastodon, that has gained some prominence. Dave, what do you think is gonna happen?
Well, I'm on Mastodon, and I think it would be wonderful if instead of 1 million, 100 million people got there, including most of the people around the world who might want to read me. My Twitter isn't that big, but I have 14,000 on LinkedIn, for example.
Mhm.
And I just discovered the other day when I looked at one of the streets, my friend Malik, who I've known for 20 years, has over 1 million followers.
Mm.
There's no technical reason you can't move over to Mastodon or to any 4 or 5 others. There was a little problem at the beginning because so many people did it, it overwhelmed the system, but they're coping now. But Twitter is where most of us will probably be. The second thing is that software that's working really well doesn't die when they lose all their programmers, which is something happened at Twitter and why people evolved. The Pirate Bay, for example, the leading pirate video site in the world, looks exactly as it did 8 years ago when the Swedes came in and arrested the people, said put them in jail, and other people took the computer code and are running it, and it works perfectly well these days.
What site is that, Dave? What's the site name?
Pirate Bay.
Pirate Bay. Okay.
Okay, it's the leading pirate site in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not here telling people that's where they should go to get all the TV that's too expensive. And it was really wonderful before we got them here in the States. Jenny loves the British mysteries. And until 3 or 4 years ago, you got very few of them here. I could always get them for her.
Mm-hmm.
But
you're talking about the open source and the impact that it is having across the board in other areas.
The two things I'm seeing on impact where I think I have it right and I've read a lot wrong. One is that Twitter is unlikely to collapse and die unless it becomes an issue over censorship and what's not censored. And the other thing, which I didn't get to when I was talking about what is Twitter and the internet done in China and Iran with the people in the streets right now. I will guarantee you that most of the organizing for the first demonstrations happened on Weibo and other Chinese websites. Because that's how you connect with everybody. You're putting together a big birthday party. You're going to put it out on Facebook or something. So it made the social media does make it easier to communicate with other people. The internet's the cheapest. The freedom of the press belongs only to those people who own a printing press, was A.J. Lieberman. Oh, sorry. And the internet is the cheapest printing press ever invented. I could go up there, and I did, having 100,000 people looking at what I wrote in 4 years, and my total cost was less than $25 a month for my server.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's possible. Doesn't always happen. So clearly what's happened is that simply having the internet even heavily censored, people are getting around and saying, hey, fellow Tiananmen citizens, why don't you come to the Quad one day at 3? It's going to be an interesting lecture. And something like that would normally get through, and everybody would know what to do, even though there's heavy censorship. And that's happening very heavily all through China. People are going on the internet, going around the censors. They censor any picture. Now somebody holding up a poster with a slogan. So what they started doing in Beijing to say what side they are, they went out to the streets and held up empty sheets of paper saying nothing. Make a point that they were opposed to what was going on. So that kind of thing is happening. And when we ask what does Twitter contribute in China and Iran, very little directly in China, because they're actually cut off. But the Chinese equivalents are very important to what's going on. It's how people get all the news. I mean, there's no truth in Pravda And China Daily doesn't have most of the truth either. Times is a much better proportion of truth, even if they're getting most of the China stories wrong right now. Okay, now, one of the things we were talking about there is Mastodon is open source, which allows people who don't have $44 billion to build something that people can use. And in fact, there are now several million people who've moved over from Twitter to Mastodon. It is a terrible interface. Twitter had 1,000 programmers. Some of them were among the best in the world. They did a lot of things right. It's much smoother to use Twitter than Mastodon, but Mastodon does function and is open source. It may function very well for the rest of our lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the Apache server, Stu?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Do you know the Apache server?
I've heard of it. I can't say that I know it, but I've certainly heard of it.
The majority of websites in the world are running on a host that is running a Unix program called Apache.
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing that keeps the websites there, sends them out to people when they ask for them, etc., etc. Apache was developed by a few computer people in the early years, and they called it, like the Patchwork Girl of Odd, a Apache server, which got shortened to Apache, and that's how it causes. And even Microsoft, which came in really hard on this in the late 90s, could not displace it because it was good software. People cared about it, kept it up. It was open source, so anybody could run it. And literally, the majority of websites on the world right now come from Apache.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the powers of open source. Programming a Twitter is hard and need a lot of people. But programming a functional equivalent of Twitter or web hosts that gets the web pages out to you, that's something that 3 bright programmers can and did do over the summer. And so it becomes possible to build a Mastodon and put it out there, just like the one I saw last night, Platform.ai, I believe it's called. But I missed the introduction of the event. It is the most exciting thing that has happened in computers for people in the last 5 years. I can turn around and say whatever phrase I want, and it will come back with a picture that's related to what I said. Several times I've done that for articles. Got something that was good enough to put as the picture in the article when I didn't have anything particular for it. What's going on? The first one to go public with this was one called OpenAI. And we talked about it here soon after it launched.
Mm-hmm.
OpenAI is the most popular, it's very well done, of place to generate artwork. So if you want to say, I want an airplane in the style of Van Gogh, it will give you an airplane in the style of Van Gogh. So the 2 things you need to know about this, which is how it does it and how it's becoming so popular. It is a triumph of machine learning, but in principle, nothing that any competent machine learning programmer couldn't have come up with. That took 1 million or more images, all of them coded with what they were, and the computer software using neural networks looked in and said, what are the patterns in these 1 million illustrations? How do we find one? And the computer software knew to connect it to people's request for a Van Gogh. One of the nice things AI just did, they took Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl. That's the one like this that became a movie and a TV show.
Yes.
That was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they expanded it. They told the computer to draw the rest of that wall and draw the rest of that desk that were in the painting
Mm-hmm.
and put a floor on. And I'm sure an expert could decide that was not done by Vermeer, but it looked darn good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so these are things that are happening. Now, the other thing that surprised me last night, and I talked to my old friend John Borthwick, who was there, is that this was matched in something called something diffusion, synthetic diffusion or something else. 3 weeks after OpenAI came out, which had $100 million budget from people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates, to basically say, all right, diffusion came out with almost the same functions because all of the software to do this was open source and they could put it together really fast.
Wow. Wow.
And I just saw a third one, the platform.ai. A brilliant data scientist, who I happen to know for her work in data scientist, put together the company within the last year. And last night, we had people coming up from the audience and playing a platform competition set up with a Vanna White person there, putting challenges out, one person here, one person there, and they had to compete with who could get the best illustration on a theme that they had to put together with only 30 seconds.
Uh-huh.
So they put something up, and some of them came out pretty good. They all looked well done. Some of them came out pretty good on the subject. Some of them in the first try didn't. But the reason I'm talking about Platform AI is she was able to put together, with a very limited amount of money and people, a piece of software that went to 100,000 images or more. To use this machine learning, you have to have a lot of things for the initial database. And have something that was good enough. She could give me a log on, and I could have been making illustrations on her software. And that's because almost all the pieces she needed for that software had been done and put open for anybody to use.
So now, David, just straighten me out on this. The magic of open software is, A, you're not paying the developers to put it together, and you have developers from all over the world that can contribute and tweak and upgrade and add to it and kind of grow the software. Is that right?
That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of it is that all these people, including everybody using it, can add to it and improve it.
Mm-hmm.
So that, for example, I was using the Joomla database for my website until a few years ago. That was put together by an international team. By the time I got involved, there were a lot in Germany, several in Australia. And the templates I was using came from Vietnam, where somebody built a small business of templates for Joomla. And they were my choice when I looked at all the different template managers to design my website. I found this one, and it happened to be in Vietnam. I didn't know that when I signed on to them. I just looked at the quality of their code. So that open source software often is better than you would get with $50 million of programmers trying to do the same thing. Not always. It needs the right people. They have to be dedicated. They have to really work hard. But there are a lot of people who can do this as a hobby. And there's a lot of people who have a business reason to do that. The guy who did my templates, I believe, put out his master software to organize the stuff he did for free as open source. But on top of it, he had particular templates for an auto shop, a newspaper, and so on. And that's what he did to make a living.
So
so
Dave,
that
tell me,
we,
where do you see the applications that you saw last night at this show where it can generate all these incredible images with just a few phrases? Where is that going to go and how's it going to be used? Consumers, by business? Where do you see that industry, if you will, going?
I've been trying to figure out that since last night when I saw it. I discovered a couple of my old friends were doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I might connect. So I connected with them, and it might be interesting to get involved. In fact, my main connection there, among other things, was one of the early investors in Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
which was commercial from the beginning. But Wikipedia was also commercial from the beginning. It turned out not to work commercially.
Really?
Yeah. Jimmy wanted to make a commercial software, raised a few $1 million, put it together. It worked, but not enough people were using it to make a business out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there's lots of different ways for this to happen, but I can and have taken the Wikimedia software, which is open source, public domain. I can do whatever I want with it, and modified it. I did it for some early database work on my DSL Prime and where broadband was. And I could take this framework that came from the people who did Wikipedia, and I could move it to just what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
It would be going to be an enormous amount of work keeping that up, and I couldn't. But if I really wanted to, it was there for me, and I could.
Yeah. The power of open source.
That was actually, now what will happen with it? Well, last night I saw a parlor game.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, the lady who led the software came up, described what she did for half an hour, and then got volunteers from the audience to come up on stage. And they were each given a prompt, like a robot who looks like Elon Musk. That wasn't the exact one, but they had something very similar to that.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to use the software to make pictures of robots who looked like Elon Musk. They didn't hit Elon Musk very well, but they had this general outline. There's in their million illustrations, there were pictures of him. And they had robots, and they had several different kinds of robots. They give you 4 examples. And it worked. They just did it.
Mm-hmm.
They never had seen the software before. None of them were artists, but they were able to come up with something that didn't look so bad. I just bought for Jenny the first illustrated novel, otherwise known as a comic book, that is actually using some of the stuff from Sable Diffusion in a commercial comic book for illustrations. And I ordered it. It wasn't, I saw some samples on the web,
Mm-hmm.
and I just ordered the book from Amazon. It was only $12 or something. And I bet when I have it, you would have a hard time deciding on half of the illustrations whether it was done by an illustrator or done by a computer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, to get to that, you need a really good program. You need a lot of time. You need a lot of trial and error. And you really need a visual sense of what's good and what's bad.
Yeah,
So
you still got to tell a story. So I mean, it sounds like one of the ways
it's sitting there in Amazon.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the ways that it could go is in terms of media and publishing and storytelling in new ways, given the just it sounds like just kind of incredible creativity that it just kind of opens up the palette when you have all this computing power that can put all these images together and create stuff in ways that we never, at least in our human minds, never thought of.
That's part of what's going to happen. That the first thing it's going to do is it's going to allow me, who have trouble drawing a straight line with the ruler, to do an illustration when I needed one. I've used it on 2 or 3 stories already.
Mm-hmm.
You get I've been using OpenAI. You get 15 free a month, and for $10 you get another 150. So it's cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is not. And they had a lot of money to start to build. They were going to do the state of the art, and they did the state of the art. But the state of the art is moved through the open source. The second thing it's going to do is they're going to put a lot of artists out of work.
Mm.
Because, and I saw when we did computerized typesetting and desktop publishing, I happened to be the guy who was writing all the accounting software for half the type shops in New York. And we had a whole lot. This Madison Avenue was the center of the advertising business.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had a dozen clients, each of which were billing over $1 million a year in type. That business died in 3 years.
Wow. That's fast.
It literally died. My clients literally, some went out of business
Mm-hmm.
from being enormously profitable to gone in 3 years, because in that case, the art directors hated sending out for type. You had to call up, get a messenger. If they didn't get it right, you had to send it again. And if you showed it to your publisher who wanted to change, and for the reason they needed somebody to do the accounting on the computers, I had to keep track of all that stuff and get it billed.
Mm-hmm.
And because the art directors had the skill they needed, had the budget to get the help that they needed or the instruction that they needed, and it really helped them do it, they said, I'm not going to send out for my typography unless it's there was one shop that survived by having 4,000 typefaces, and nobody at Ogilvy and Mather had 4,000 typefaces. So if you wanted something really special, you went to him. You didn't care when you're paying. It's an $80,000 magazine ad, so you'll pay $1,000 to get the typeface you want.
Mm-hmm.
But out of 18 clients or so that I had, 4 of them were still in business 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you see this trend that's probably going to happen for illustrators and artists and designers, given that AI now is capable of such fantastic stuff.
AI may not be as fantastic as the art director working with a typographer who could get something just right, but it's good enough. If you have an art director who knows what's good and can do design and has a really strong reason to do it, that all the art directors started doing their own stuff immediately because they hated the back and forth and messages.
Yeah, and just the cost and the time factor is like no contest. Yeah. Wow. Well, Dave, we are just about out of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about crypto. I guess we may have to wait until our next show to do that. So much going on with it.
Let me do 2 minutes of things.
Okay, you know, the FTX meltdown, and I know we've talked about crypto going back several years on the show. I know you have some strong opinions, so shoot.
Okay. The crypto idea, the blockchain itself, is a very useful programmer's tool that can let you set up an exchange system, say for my food co-op, and not have to worry about checks and sending the money through the bank. It's useful stuff. But what came out of it, the first thing, was cryptocurrency, where using this crypto, you could build a system that reliably managed $300 billion around the world anonymously and send the money from Venezuela to El Salvador or the US to Lebanon. And it works. There is $300 billion sitting on the blockchain. The question is, why do people think it's like money? Well, money has no value in the first place. I pick up a dollar bill, that's just a piece of paper printed a particular way. But it had behind it, in history, silver or gold, which was considered something of value directly. And then since the US went off the silver standard, it had the complete faith and revenue of the United States government backing that dollar. And since the United States government has been the most stable government for the last 100 years, because we haven't had any wars here on our territory, it was considered the safest thing you could do. A lot. And that was why Saddam Hussein had storerooms with billions of US $100 bills, which were found after the war, because they were confident that a $100 bill was going to be worth something. The blockchain people said, well, we can make a guaranteed record, absolutely solid, and to come up with this currency, we're going to give you some mathematical problems that you have to run on the computer. And if you run enough of them, you get a token or a crypto. And they said, because it's so hard to come up with these, and there's a limited number of them, of course they're going to be valuable. And we had a jerk on this show, probably a nice guy, but he is one of the people who was drinking the Kool-Aid, say they can't go down because they're only a limited number. Well, one of the biggest ones went down from $10 billion to nothing in less than 10 days. Now, they happen to be massive fraud, and there's a lot of massive fraud out there. It was an exaggerated Ponzi scheme. But the reason I wanted to take the 2 minutes, and I went over 2 minutes, I'm sorry, was to point out to people, I don't know what a token is going to be worth next year, and it may very well go up. But there's no guarantee behind it. And you can go from $10 billion to bankrupt in 10 days because of fraud. And you could go in the main thing from $1 trillion value to a $300 billion value in the course of a few months. You lose 2/3 of your money because there's nothing behind it. There's no guarantee. I'm not saying to sell the damn things and sell them short, because I don't know whether they're going to go up or down for the next year or 5 years. But I do know there's no guarantee that you can't lose all your money fast.
Okay. Well, you heard it. There's Dave Burstein on cryptocurrency. This has been Community and Technology. Dave, thanks so much for the conversation today. We covered a lot of ground from the artificial intelligence and art to Twitter to Mastodon to crypto.
And the people in the streets in Beijing.
Yes, okay.
Which did include Tsinghua University. A friend of mine is a Stanford professor. He feels that there are 4 universities that he's competing with. He does electrical engineering. He's the guy who invented DSL and so on. And he says at this point, he looks over his shoulder at Berkeley, MIT, and he now puts Tsinghua in that category because it's gotten that good.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. Okay, that was the last word for today on Community and Technology from Dave Burstein and Stu Reed. Stay tuned for more news, information, entertainment on WHCR 90.3, The Voice of Harlem. And don't forget to tune in every Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. for more Community and Technology. Thanks for tuning in. Good night.